For much of its course through Egypt, the Nile runs through a landscape defined by close contrasts. Water and cultivated ground occupy a long corridor, while desert lies beyond it. In some parts of the Nile Valley, that usable strip is comparatively narrow. Farther north, the river enters the delta, where the landscape opens into a broader region, once crossed by multiple branches and channels on the way toward the Mediterranean. That simple picture is useful, but it should not be mistaken for a fixed map of the ancient world. Geological and environmental research shows that Nile channels and floodplains shifted over long periods. River branches moved, levees developed, wet ground expanded or contracted, and places that once had easier access to water could later become more distant from an active channel. The modern Nile, therefore, gives us only part of the geography in which ancient Egyptian communities lived. This changing river corridor will be the main guide through our journey. In ancient Egyptian geography, Upper Egypt lay to the south, along the Nile Valley, while Lower Egypt lay to the north, especially in the delta. The names can sound reversed to a modern listener looking at a map. They follow the river instead. The Nile flows northward, so Upper Egypt is upriver, and Lower Egypt is downriver. For the human story, our starting horizon is the later 4th millennium BCE, before Egypt's dynastic state was fully established. Along the valley, the relationship between river, cultivated land, and desert could be especially clear. Fields and settlements occupied the livable and productive ground beside the Nile, while the desert margins offered a sharply different environment nearby. The exact width and shape of these zones varied from place to place. The delta was different again, broader, flatter, and historically crossed by a changing network of waterways. The annual rise of the Nile was fundamental to agricultural life, but the familiar image of a perfectly regular flood should also be softened. Inundation created agricultural opportunities, yet its magnitude and local effects varied. Over longer stretches of time, channels migrated and river landscapes changed. A community's relationship with the water was therefore not simply a matter of living beside one permanent riverbank. For people living along this corridor, geography shaped practical choices without dictating every outcome. Access to cultivable ground mattered. So did routes between settlements, fields, river landings, and the desert edge. River travel could connect communities that were separated by substantial distances along the valley. At the same time, local conditions differed. A settlement in the southern valley did not occupy the same physical setting as one in the delta, and an ancient settlement's waterside position cannot always be reconstructed simply by looking at the river today. That matters when archaeologists try to place ancient communities back into their original setting. A settlement now separated from the main channel may once have stood closer to navigable water, while another may have occupied a levee or patch of higher ground within a wetter floodplain. These reconstructions depend on sediments, landforms, buried channels, and settlement remains rather than on a single surviving shoreline. They give us a landscape made of changing relationships, not a fixed background. In this later 4th millennium setting, the period often described as the later Predynastic era, communities along the Nile were already part of a landscape of growing settlement and increasing political complexity. Predynastic here simply means the long period before the dynastic Egyptian state was fully established. It is a convenient label, but it should not suggest that people were merely waiting for the better-known age of kings and monuments to begin. Archaeology, instead, shows communities with their own settlements, production, exchange, storage, and regional relationships. In parts of Upper Egypt, some centers became larger and more influential over time. Material remains allow archaeologists to trace changes in settlement and organization, although the precise causes behind those changes are more difficult to reduce to a single explanation. The Nile was clearly important to this process. It provided a corridor for movement and connected inhabited and cultivable zones along a long north-south route. Agricultural production created resources that could be stored and redistributed. Yet it would be misleading to say that the river simply created the Egyptian state. Political consolidation involved human institutions, competition, cooperation, production, administration, and relationships among communities. Environment provided conditions and constraints. It did not write the political future by itself. Storage offers one quiet material clue to this larger transformation. Agricultural produce does not only feed a household at the moment it is harvested. Once grain and other resources can be collected and kept, they can also become part of wider systems of support, obligation, and control. Archaeological evidence for settlement and storage belongs to this story of increasing organization, even when it cannot tell us exactly how every institution worked. The built environment of these early communities also requires some adjustment to the image most often associated with ancient Egypt. Stone monuments dominate modern photographs because stone can survive spectacularly. Settlements and many everyday structures were commonly built with mudbrick, a material whose archaeological survival is very different. The inhabited landscape of ancient Egypt was not a continuous world of stone. Much of the fabric of ordinary settlement was more vulnerable to erosion, rebuilding, later occupation, and the movement of the river itself. This difference in survival matters because archaeology is always shaped by what remains. A cemetery at the desert margin, a stone monument, or a settlement preserved under unusually favorable conditions may be easier to investigate than places repeatedly rebuilt on productive land. The surviving map of ancient Egypt is not identical to the map that ancient people knew. Around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, the broad historical label changes. Egypt enters what historians call the early dynastic period, when a unified kingship and larger political structures are more clearly visible. Exact dates vary among chronological systems, so the transition is better treated as a broad horizon than as a single moment. Here, the important change is scale. River-connected communities were increasingly incorporated into political and administrative systems that reached across larger parts of the Nile corridor. Even then, the landscape remained varied. The river could join distant places without making them identical. The valley retained its narrow stretches of cultivated ground. The delta retained its broader and more complex waterways. Settlements stood in different relationships to fields, channels, desert edges, and routes of movement, and the Nile itself continued to change. So the first landscape of ancient Egyptian history is not a static strip of green placed between two deserts. It is a shifting river system inhabited by communities whose own arrangements were changing as well. Water, soil, settlement, storage, and movement formed overlapping parts of that world. From here, the river corridor can be followed into one of its most persistent material systems, the production of food. Fields beside the Nile supported households and institutions alike, while grain could pass from harvest to storage, and from storage into wider networks of labor and administration. The landscape we have been tracing now becomes, more closely, a working agricultural one. The cultivated land beside the Nile was never simply scenery. It was working ground, and one of its most durable products was grain. Grown in the river's agricultural corridor, grain could be harvested, processed, stored, measured, issued, collected, and moved. Those actions connected fields to households, estates, institutions, and workforces across long stretches of Egyptian history. The details changed from one period and region to another. The Nile's flood created agricultural opportunity, local water management mattered, and cultivation depended on the conditions of particular landscapes. The most useful path, though, is a simpler one. We can follow grain after it has been grown and see what happens when food becomes something that can be stored. Cereal cultivation was a major foundation of Egyptian agriculture. Archaeobotanical evidence, administrative texts, storage remains, and other sources make grain especially visible. Its importance should not be confused with a complete picture of diet. Ancient Egyptians grew and consumed other foods as well. Here, the evidence is strongest when grain is treated as a material and administrative system, rather than as the beginning of a menu. Once harvested, grain could be kept beyond the immediate moment of production. That made storage important at several scales. Archaeology preserves storage rooms, bins, vessels, and larger granary spaces in different settings. Mudbrick was commonly used for such structures, so their survival is uneven. Even so, the physical act is easy to understand. Grain occupies space. It has to be gathered, contained, protected, measured, and eventually taken out again. A storehouse turns an agricultural product into a reserve that can support activity elsewhere. Grain kept in storage might remain associated with a household, an estate, or a larger institution. The relationships among these settings changed over time, and the surviving evidence does not support one timeless model in which every field simply fed a central state granary. Landholding and institutional control were more varied than that. The scale of storage could also change the scale of the problem. A household container and a larger institutional storage area both held food, but they implied different patterns of collection and access. Larger stores required space, repeated handling, and some method of keeping track of what entered and left. The surviving architecture and records do not give us one standard granary plan for every period. Together, they make storage visible as organized work between harvest and consumption. Estate records and other documents from pharaonic Egypt show agricultural production tied to organized property and administration. An estate could link land, workers, storage, and distribution. But even here, the useful anchor is the grain itself. It passes from cultivated ground into a storage space. Once there, it can be counted and assigned. Administrative systems become visible because a physical commodity has to be accounted for. Measurement mattered because storage alone was not enough. Within documented provisioning systems, grain could support labor through quantities that were assessed and portions that were issued. Documentary evidence from different periods records rations in institutional settings. These records do not show that every person in Egypt lived on a standardized allowance. They do show that some workforces were provisioned through measured distributions of food. A ration, in this context, is best understood as an allocation. It connects a stored commodity to a person or group within a documented system. The surviving records can make that process seem impersonal. Amounts are entered, deliveries are noted, and distributions are tracked. Yet each line ultimately refers to food leaving storage and being directed toward people whose work depended on regular provisioning. This is one reason grain appears so often where agriculture and administration meet. It could be grown in quantity, stored, measured, and transferred. That made it useful not only as food, but also as something institutions could collect and redistribute. Taxation could include grain and other agricultural goods, although tax mechanisms differed by period and institution. The evidence does not support one universal tax system applied in the same way across all of ancient Egyptian history. Keeping the material sequence in view helps prevent the system from becoming too abstract. A quantity of grain begins in cultivated land. It enters a storage space. Someone measures it. Part may remain where it was collected. Part may be issued as a ration. Part may be transferred as an obligation or tax. The exact pathway varied, but the repeated need to move real goods through real spaces is what made administration necessary. Visual sources sometimes show agricultural work, storage, or the handling of produce, and funerary models can preserve miniature representations of estate activities. These are useful forms of evidence, but they require caution. A funerary model was made for a funerary setting. It cannot be treated as if it were a neutral photograph of an ordinary working day. Such objects can support what is already visible in archaeological and documentary evidence, but they should not carry the whole reconstruction by themselves. The same caution applies to the word farmer. Agricultural work in ancient Egypt existed within households, estates, institutional properties, and larger systems of obligation. Surviving records often preserve institutions more clearly than they preserve individual lives. They tell us a great deal about quantities, property, deliveries, and storage. They tell us less consistently about how every person involved understood their own place within those arrangements. At the scale of a storage room, however, the system becomes tangible again. Grain has weight and volume. Vessels take up floor space. Bins and granaries shape the movement of people through a building. Processing equipment links stored grain to the labor required before it could be consumed or distributed in another form. These material traces help bring institutional history back to the level of objects and rooms. Across the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and other periods, the organization behind agriculture changed. Estates differed. Institutions changed in scale and authority. Landholding was not static. Administrative practice developed in different ways. The broad continuity lies less in one political arrangement than in the recurring practical problem. Food grown beside the Nile had to pass through systems of storage and distribution if it was to support people beyond the field where it was harvested. That recurring problem joined landscape to labor. It also joined agriculture to record keeping. A stored commodity could be counted. A counted commodity could be assigned. Once goods were being collected and issued across institutions, written administration became increasingly useful, although the fuller world of records and scribes belongs later in our journey. For now, the grain is still the clearest guide. It has moved from cultivated land into bins, vessels, and granaries. It has been measured, allocated, and collected within different institutional arrangements. And once it leaves those storage spaces, another practical question becomes unavoidable. How do goods move between fields, estates, settlements, workforces, and administrative centers? Along the Nile, much of that movement could take place on water. Stored produce could leave the stillness of a granary and enter a wider network of transport, where boats connected communities along the inhabited river corridor. Grain has now left storage. Once produce, tools, people, or records had to move beyond the place where they were kept. the Nile became more than a boundary beside cultivated land. It became a route through the inhabited corridor. Boats were used on the Nile from very early periods, and their forms changed across Egyptian history. Some craft could be made from bundles of papyrus stems. Others were built from wood. Surviving images, archaeological finds, and studies of transport show a long tradition of water travel, but no single vessel represents every journey or every period. The simplest journeys could be local. A crossing from one bank to another might connect a settlement with fields, work areas, or routes beginning on the opposite side. Ferries and other small craft could serve this practical geography. The river did not merely carry travelers over long distances. It also divided nearby places, so crossing it was itself part of ordinary movement. Other journeys followed the river for greater distances. Along the Nile Valley, settlements occupied a long, narrow corridor. Water travel could connect places arranged one after another along that line. In the delta, movement took place through a more complicated network of branches and waterways, although the precise pattern of channels changed over time. The physical landscape mattered to transport. A settlement close to an active channel had different access from one separated by shallows, wet ground, or a shifting river course. Landing areas were points where river movement became work on land. Cargo had to be brought to the water, placed aboard, removed again, and carried onward. A landing place could be a modest place, a practical meeting point between movement on water and movement on land. People arriving by water still needed a path into the settlement or toward fields and storage areas. Goods arriving from inland had to make the reverse journey before they could be loaded. Even a short crossing depended on the connection between bank, boat, and the route onward. The boat was only one part of that chain of movement. Grain gives us an easy example because it has already followed us from field to storage. Once it left a granary, it could become cargo. Containers and bulk goods took up space. Loading and unloading required labor. A boat carrying agricultural produce connected a storehouse with a destination and with the people responsible for the transfer. Manufactured goods could move in the same broad system. Materials and finished objects traveled between places where they were produced, stored, used, or redistributed. Boats also carried people involved in administration and work. In this sense, river transport connected the institutional world of records and provisioning to the physical geography of settlements. The river is now functioning as a road through the inhabited corridor. That comparison is useful, but it should not be taken too literally. Water routes and land routes worked together. Some journeys could be made by boat for one part and continued overland for another. Desert routes were important, where destinations lay away from the floodplain, and local paths connected river landings with fields, houses, workshops, temples, and storage areas. Ancient evidence for boats comes in several forms. Archaeology preserves parts of vessels and equipment in some contexts. Images show boats being used for transport and other activities. Early rock art has also been discussed as evidence for boat imagery, though interpretation requires caution. Pictures can tell us that certain kinds of craft and activities were meaningful enough to represent, but they cannot always tell us exactly how a particular journey worked. Papyrus craft are one part of that evidence. The papyrus plant had many uses in Egypt, and bundled stems could be used for small craft. These should not be allowed to stand in for the entire history of Egyptian boats. Wooden vessels were also important, and the surviving evidence preserves a much wider range of boat forms and uses than papyrus skiffs alone. The useful distinction here is practical. Different craft served different kinds of movement. Crews turned that movement back into human work. Boats had to be handled, guided, loaded, unloaded, maintained, and connected to activity on shore. A cargo journey involved a vessel and a river, but also people at several points in the chain, from the place where goods were assembled to the place where they were received. Administrative systems depended on these practical connections. Goods collected in one place could be transferred to another. Workforces could be provisioned. Officials and records could move through the same wider transport landscape. Later in our journey, one unusually detailed set of documents will allow us to look closely at royal logistics connected with stone transport. For now, it is enough to keep the broader system in view. Boats were working parts of administration as well as everyday mobility. This is also why transport evidence can illuminate places that seem separate when studied one by one. A granary, a workshop, a temple estate, or a settlement might each preserve its own archaeological traces, yet movement joins such places into wider systems. Boats help explain how stored goods became supplies elsewhere and how production in one location could enter use or redistribution in another. Because the Nile changed, access changed too. Ancient channels did not remain fixed for the whole span of Egyptian history. A landing place useful in one period might not occupy the same relationship to the river in another. Reconstructing transport requires the same caution used for settlements and floodplains. The modern river is not a complete map of ancient movement. This matters especially when river travel is made to sound effortless. Boats could make movement along the Nile practical, but not every journey was simple, direct, or entirely by water. Routes depended on destination, cargo, local geography, available craft, and the condition of channels and landing places. The Nile connected Egypt without turning the whole country into one continuous waterside street. Still, the connective effect was profound. In a long river valley, boats could bring grain, manufactured goods, workers, administrators, and travelers into repeated contact with places far beyond a single settlement. The river linked agricultural ground to storage, storage to transport, and transport to the built places where goods and people arrived. That is where this journey now narrows. A boat approaches a landing zone, and movement on water gives way to movement through a settlement. Beyond the riverbank are streets, walls, storage spaces, work areas, and houses built largely from materials that survive very differently from the stone monuments more familiar today. The Nile has carried us to the edge of those inhabited spaces. From here, the route continues on foot into mudbrick streets and household rooms. The boat journey ends at inhabited ground. From a landing place, movement narrows into paths and streets, then into courtyards, doorways, and rooms. This is the scale at which ancient Egyptian settlement archaeology changes the picture most familiar from temples and tombs. Much of everyday built space was made from mudbrick, and mudbrick survives very differently from monumental stone. That difference shapes what can still be seen. Stone walls, columns, and tomb chambers may remain prominent for thousands of years. Mudbrick houses could be rebuilt, eroded, cut through by later occupation, or lost where settlement continued. The surviving remains of towns and villages are uneven. Even so, excavated settlements preserve plans, walls, storage areas, pottery, tools, and other traces that bring the ancient Nile corridor down to the scale of household space. One useful example is Edfu in Upper Egypt. Archaeological work there has traced a settlement occupied across a long span of ancient Egyptian history. Its importance here is not that Edfu provides a model house for all of Egypt. It shows something more useful. Settlements could accumulate through time, with domestic and institutional spaces forming part of a lived town whose history extended well beyond any single building phase. At street level, archaeology can preserve patterns of circulation. Walls define passages between structures. Open areas may separate one group of buildings from another. Entrances connect outside movement with interior rooms. These plans do not tell us exactly who walked through each doorway on an ordinary day, but they reveal how built space was organized and how people had to move through it. Mudbrick itself was an ordinary building material in many excavated settlements. It could form exterior walls, internal divisions, storage spaces, and other parts of the built environment. Its archaeological texture is very different from dressed stone. A mudbrick wall may survive as a low line of brickwork rather than as the kind of standing architecture that dominates modern images of Egypt. Inside excavated houses, the evidence becomes more intimate, but also more local. Rooms can contain storage vessels, food preparation installations, pottery, tools, and personal objects. Such remains allow archaeologists to identify activities that happened in or near domestic space. They do not, by themselves, tell us that every room had one permanent purpose, or that every household across Egypt arranged its work in the same way. The objects also matter because buildings rarely survive with all of their original contents intact. Pottery may outlast organic materials. A storage jar can remain when what it once held has disappeared. An oven or hearth can preserve the location of preparation even when the sequence of daily tasks around it is no longer recoverable. Household archaeology, therefore, works from partial combinations of architecture, installations, and objects. It rarely offers a complete, frozen interior. Storage also reconnects household space with fields, granaries, and river transport. Grain and other goods that moved through those systems could also enter household settings. Jars and other containers occupied real space inside buildings. Food preparation could leave installations and material traces. Work could happen within or near houses, as well as in more distinct working areas. A second major example comes from Amarna, the New Kingdom royal city founded in Middle Egypt. Amarna is unusually informative because substantial areas of settlement have been excavated and studied. House plans and their associated objects preserve evidence for rooms, storage, household activity, and differences among residences. Those differences matter. Houses at Amarna were not all the same size or arranged in one standardized pattern. Material access and built space varied. Some residences were larger and more elaborate than others. Architecture and possessions can reveal social differences, although wealth, occupation, institutional position, and social identity should not be treated as interchangeable categories. Amarna also comes with an important warning. It was a short-lived royal foundation, created in a particular political and religious setting. Its unusually visible settlement archaeology makes it valuable precisely because so much can be studied there. It should not become a substitute for every other Egyptian town. Within the wider Amarna landscape, the workman's village makes the problem of representativeness even clearer. This was a walled, planned settlement with 72 mudbrick houses. Archaeological work has also identified chapels, tombs, garden beds, and animal pens associated with the community. The regularity of the housing makes the site especially useful for examining planned space. But planned space is not the same as universal space. The village was a special community in a special city. Its standardized houses cannot be turned into a template for the home of a farmer in another region, a household in a long-established town, or an elite residence elsewhere at Amarna. By this point, several kinds of settlement have come into view. A long-occupied town such as Edfu, the broader royal foundation at Amarna, and a planned workmen's community within that landscape. These are selected excavated examples. They are not pieces of one imaginary Egyptian town. Their value lies in their differences as much as in the features they share. Returning to the smaller scale helps keep that distinction clear. A street leads to a house. A house is divided into rooms and working areas. Containers hold goods. Installations mark preparation or storage. Tools and other objects indicate tasks carried out nearby. Each archaeological context preserves only part of the activity that once took place there. But together, these traces make domestic history materially visible. They also show how much of daily history depends on modest remains. A wall line, a vessel, a tool, or an installation fixed into a room. Household archaeology can also reveal limits. A floor plan does not automatically identify the family that occupied it. A large house does not, by itself, explain the status of every person who lived or worked there. Written evidence can sometimes clarify kinship, inheritance, or property relationships, but those cases are unevenly preserved. The safest reconstruction begins with the building and the objects, then adds social interpretation only where the evidence allows it. That caution matters because the idea of daily life can easily become too smooth. Ancient Egyptian society contained differences in wealth, occupation, institutional connection, region, and period. Domestic archaeology does not erase those differences. It gives them physical form. The contrast with monumental Egypt involves more than size. Temples and tombs often preserve formal architecture, inscriptions, images, and stonework created for particular purposes. Settlement archaeology preserves a different range of evidence. Mudbrick walls, ordinary containers, food preparation, storage, circulation, and traces of work. Neither category tells the whole story, but together they produce a broader historical landscape. Near the end of this domestic scale, work becomes increasingly visible. Tools appear in household assemblages. Materials were stored, prepared, repaired, or transformed in and around living spaces. Some production remained closely tied to households, while other tasks belonged to specialist workshops or organized workforces. The street, house, and room have brought us toward another scale. Household traces lead naturally to the people who shaped stone, worked metal, used specialized tools, and produced objects within workshops and institutions across the Nile world. A tool is one of the simplest traces of work. Beside it, archaeology may preserve chips of stone, fragments of metalworking debris, unfinished material, or the remains of a space where production took place. These traces are modest compared with a finished monument, but they record the stages that came before completion. Work happened at different scales across ancient Egypt. Some tasks took place in or near households. Others were concentrated in workshops or organized through estates, temples, royal projects, and other institutions. The people involved did not all occupy the same social position, and their work was not organized in one uniform way across the long pharaonic period. The focus here is work, what people made, what survives from making it, and how some workforces were organized. Stone provides a useful starting material because the finished results survive so visibly. Building blocks, statues, vessels, architectural elements, and carved surfaces all depended on stages of extraction, shaping, smoothing, and finishing. Archaeological evidence includes tools, tool marks, unfinished pieces, quarry traces, and debris left by production. An unfinished object can be especially informative. Completion hides some stages of manufacture, while an abandoned or unfinished piece may preserve them. A partly worked surface can show where material was removed. Debris records what was cut away. Tools and marks connect the final object to repeated physical actions carried out by workers. Stoneworking also reminds us that skill was not one simple category. Different tasks required different knowledge, materials, and degrees of specialization. A worker shaping stone for a large project did not necessarily have the same role as someone carrying material, preparing supplies, or maintaining a work area. Large projects could bring together different forms of labor within one wider operation. Metalworking gives another view of production. Copper-based metallurgy is securely attested in ancient Egypt, and metallurgical evidence shows specialized knowledge involved in working metal. Tools themselves belong to a longer chain of production. Raw material had to be acquired and processed. Tools then had to be shaped, used, maintained, and sometimes replaced. Stone and copper are useful here because both make process visible. They also show why archaeology pays attention to waste. A finished object may travel far from the place where it was made. Workshop debris is often less mobile. Material discarded during production can help identify where particular kinds of work occurred. The debris can also preserve sequence. Fragments left after shaping, pieces discarded during manufacture, and unfinished material place attention on the work between raw material and completed object. In a workshop context, these traces can be read alongside tools and installations. They rarely identify every worker who took part, but they can show that production happened in a particular place and that making an object involved several observable stages. Together, these traces keep the process materially grounded. Some workspaces were archaeologically distinct, while other production overlapped with domestic areas. The boundary between household work and specialist work was not identical everywhere. A settlement might include rooms or spaces associated with production, while an institution or royal project could organize workers on a much larger scale. One of the richest surviving examples comes from Deir el-Medina, a New Kingdom workmen's village on the West Bank at Thebes. Its inhabitants included skilled workers involved in the construction and decoration of royal tombs. The settlement and its documents preserve an unusually detailed record of a specialized community connected to royal work. The value of Deir el-Medina lies partly in the combination of archaeology and writing. Houses and material remains provide one kind of evidence. Ostraka and other documents preserve another. An ostrakon is a piece of pottery or limestone used as a writing surface. At Deir el-Medina, surviving records include information about work groups, absences, supplies, and rations. These records make organization visible at a human scale. Workers could appear as members of groups rather than as an anonymous mass. Provisioning could be recorded. Work could be tracked. Written evidence adds another layer to the tools, debris, houses, and unfinished material preserved by archaeology. It would be easy, however, to let Deir el-Medina become a model for Egyptian labor as a whole. It was not. This was a specialized royal community in a particular place and period, serving a particular kind of project. Its unusually rich documentation is one reason it is so valuable, and also one reason it must be used carefully. Beyond this community, labor existed in many other arrangements. Agricultural work, household production, specialist craft, institutional service, and project labor could involve different obligations and forms of dependence. The evidence does not fit neatly into a choice between completely free wage labor on one side and slavery on the other. That distinction matters especially when large royal projects enter the discussion. Work could be organized through obligations, provisioning, institutional attachment, specialized service, or other arrangements that varied by context. Social position also differed among workers. Some possessed highly specialized skills. Others performed supporting or more general labor. A single diagram of social ranks would flatten those differences. Returning to the material evidence keeps the subject manageable. A stone chip belongs to a process of cutting or shaping. An unfinished object preserves a stage of manufacture. Metalworking debris points toward another kind of production. A tool links skill to repeated physical work. In the right context, these remains can also be connected to buildings, workshops, work groups, or records. Provisioning is one connection between work and administration. The grain and other supplies encountered earlier in the journey could support organized workforces. At Deir el-Medina, ration records belong to the unusually detailed documentary evidence for the community. Elsewhere, the form and scale of provisioning could differ, and surviving records are uneven. This is where material production begins to lead toward written administration. Once labor is organized across groups, projects, or institutions, someone may need to track people, time, supplies, deliveries, or stored goods. Archaeology preserves the work itself in objects and debris. Documents can preserve some of the systems around that work. The transition is visible even in something as small as an ostracon. A broken piece of pottery can cease to be only discarded material when writing is added to its surface. It can carry a note, a list, or a record connected to work and administration. Tools have brought us from household rooms into workshops and organized work communities. Marks, accounts, lists, and writing surfaces reveal another part of that work, the recording of goods and labor within Egyptian institutions. A broken piece of pottery can be a record. At Deir el-Medina and other documented settings, such writing surfaces preserve notes, accounts, lists, and details of work. The object itself is simple. What was written on it could connect a person, a quantity of grain, a delivery, or a task to a larger institutional system. Egyptian administration is easiest to approach through something that had to be counted, rather than through offices and titles. Grain in a storehouse is one example. A work group is another. Once goods, labor, or obligations had to be tracked beyond immediate memory, writing and other marking systems became practical tools of organization. Ancient Egyptian writing did not take only one form. Monumental hieroglyphs are the most familiar today, but they were only part of a wider writing practice. More cursive forms were used for many documentary purposes, and administrative records could be written on papyrus as well as on pieces of pottery or limestone. Papyrus was itself a manufactured writing material made from a plant associated with the Nile environment. Sheets provided a portable surface for documents that could be stored or carried. Ostraka, pottery sherds or limestone flakes used as writing surfaces, offered another surface, especially useful for shorter records and notes. The important distinction is functional. Monumental inscriptions and everyday administrative records did not serve identical purposes. A text on a temple wall occupied a different material setting from a list written on a scrap of pottery. Both belonged to Egyptian writing, but the second kind of evidence often brings us closer to the repeated work of counting, noting, assigning, and checking. Not everyone in ancient Egypt was literate, and scribe should not be treated as one identical occupation across every period. Writing skills were connected to institutions and particular forms of work. Surviving documents reveal people engaged in record-keeping, but they do not allow us to turn literacy into a universal social experience. Return to the grain. A quantity of grain enters a storage space. It may be measured. A record may note what was received, issued, owed, or transferred. The physical commodity remains the same grain that appeared earlier in the journey, but the written record allows an institution to track its movement beyond a single room or moment. Storage and administration met in practical ways. Goods occupied space, and quantities changed when something entered or left. A delivery could be recorded. A ration could be allocated. An account could preserve a transaction or obligation. Surviving documents vary greatly, and institutions did not all use identical procedures. Even so, the broad relationship between stored goods and record-keeping is well established. The writing surface also belongs to that chain of material work. Papyrus had to be prepared before it could carry a document. A pottery sherd or limestone flake could instead provide a smaller surface for a brief record. Writing surface, stored commodity, and measured quantity all occupied the same practical world. Administration, like transport, depended on physical objects. A record had to exist somewhere, and its usefulness depended on people being able to connect what was written with the goods, work, or obligation being recorded. The connection was practical. Taxation belongs to the same material world. In different periods and institutional settings, obligations could involve grain, livestock, other commodities, or labor. There was no single unchanged Egyptian tax system operating across 3,000 years. The evidence instead shows changing mechanisms for collecting resources and obligations within different administrative arrangements. That variation matters because words such as tax can sound more uniform than the ancient evidence allows. A record of grain collected in one context does not automatically explain taxation everywhere else. Administrative documents are strongest when they are allowed to describe the system from which they actually survive. At the level of one stored commodity, the process remains easier to follow. Grain is grown. Some enters storage. A quantity is measured. A written entry may record collection or distribution. Part of that grain may later support a work group through rationed provisioning. The same sequence connects agricultural production to institutions without requiring a catalog of administrative offices. Labor records provide another point of contact. At Deir el-Medina, surviving documents record work groups, absences, supplies, and rations. These texts make organized labor unusually visible. Deir el-Medina, however, was a specialized royal community. Its archive is valuable because it is unusually rich, not because every Egyptian workforce left the same kind of record. Other forms of marking could also operate alongside written documents. Identity marks are known from some contexts and could help identify people, groups, or objects without requiring every practical distinction to be expressed through a full written text. Their presence is another reminder that administration extended beyond formal inscriptions. A mark, a label, or a list has meaning because it is attached to something. A jar may contain a commodity. A storage room holds goods. A work group receives provisions. A record preserves a quantity or assignment. Keeping these connections visible prevents administration from becoming an invisible layer floating above the places already visited in this journey. The surviving evidence is still selective. Administrative texts disproportionately preserve the concerns of institutions able to produce and keep records. They can reveal systems of taxation, provisioning, labor, land, and storage with remarkable detail, while leaving much of the wider population less visible. A list of rations may tell us exactly what an institution recorded and still tell us much less about the full life of the person receiving them. This selectivity is part of the evidence, not a flaw to be hidden. Written records are powerful because they preserve relationships that objects alone may not reveal. At the same time, archaeology can place those records back among storage rooms, houses, workshops, river routes, and material goods. By now, the pattern is familiar. Grain grows beside the river. It enters storage. Workers and institutions move goods through the Nile corridor. Tools and workshops turn materials into finished objects. Writing adds another layer by making quantities, assignments, deliveries, and obligations recordable. Some surviving documents go further. Instead of preserving only a total or a list, they follow activity through time and movement through space. A work log can connect a crew with repeated journeys and cargo. Such records give administrative writing a geographical shape. That possibility leads directly toward the great stone landscape at Giza. There, monumental building can be approached through the same systems already established here: workers, provisions, waterways, cargo, storage, and records. At Giza, those systems become concrete. Stone moves, crews work, and a surviving set of papyri allows part of that movement to be followed with unusual precision. One Old Kingdom record follows a crew moving limestone by water. The text belongs to the reign of Khufu, the king associated with the Great Pyramid at Giza. It does not explain every stage of pyramid construction. What it preserves instead is something more limited and unusually useful. Part of the logistical system that moved stone, workers, and supplies through a royal building project. Giza is often approached from the monuments first. The pyramids rise above the desert edge, and their scale naturally draws attention toward engineering. A useful starting point lies lower in the landscape. The pyramid complex belonged to a river-connected world of landing places, routes, settlements, storage, administration, and labor. Research into ancient Nile channels has changed how this setting can be understood. The river did not occupy exactly the same course it does today, and scholars have reconstructed former waterways near the pyramid fields. Those reconstructions are based on environmental and archaeological evidence rather than on a surviving Old Kingdom shoreline. They help explain how a monument now associated with the desert edge could still belong to a transport system tied closely to the Nile. Stone itself makes the logistical problem concrete. Egyptian builders selected different stones for different monumental purposes. At Giza, Enormous quantities of material had to be quarried, shaped, moved, supplied to working areas, and incorporated into construction. The surviving monuments show the result. Other evidence lets us look at parts of the system behind it. South of the main pyramid field, excavation at Hayt el-Garab has revealed a settlement associated with pyramid-era labor. Its remains include streets, galleries, storage areas, and administrative spaces. The site gives monumental construction a built environment beyond the monuments themselves. The archaeology points toward an organized settlement supporting work on a large royal project, rather than an undifferentiated camp. Food and other supplies had to reach the people living and working there. Storage required space. Administrative activity left its own traces. Streets and galleries gave the settlement a physical layout through which people and goods moved. Seen at this scale, the pyramid project becomes less a single act of building than a connected sequence of support. Supplies entered storage. People moved between living and working areas. Administrative spaces belonged beside the material demands of food, labor, and construction. The surviving settlement does not reproduce every part of that system equally, but it makes clear that monumental work depended on an inhabited and organized support landscape, as well as on the stone rising nearby at Giza. The caution from Deir el-Medina still applies in a different period and setting. Hayt el-Garab should not be turned into a model for every Egyptian workforce. It belongs to a particular Old Kingdom project at Giza. Its value lies in showing how one major royal building program could be supported by settlement infrastructure, provisioning, storage, and administration. This is a logistics story: stone, crews, river routes, storage, and records around one Old Kingdom royal project. From the settlement, attention returns to the river. Stone did not begin at the pyramid field. Some of it came from elsewhere and had to be transported toward Giza. One especially important source for that movement was discovered far from the pyramids, at Wadi el-Jarf on the Red Sea coast. Among the papyri found, there is a work diary associated with a man named Merer. His record belongs to Khufu's reign. It follows the activities of a crew and includes the transport of limestone from Tura toward the royal project at Giza. Tura lay on the eastern side of the Nile, south of the pyramid field. Its fine limestone was used in royal building. Merer's log turns that movement from a general possibility into a documented operation. A named crew traveled as part of a managed transport system, collecting and moving stone through waterways connected with the Nile. The value of the diary is its ordinary administrative detail. It is not a manual for pyramid construction. It records work. Journeys occur within a schedule. Cargo moves from one place toward another. The record belongs to the administrative world of counting, assigning, and tracking. But here, that system also has a geographical root. That distinction matters because the pyramids have attracted many reconstructions of ramps, lifting systems, and building techniques. Some parts of construction are better understood than others, but the exact combination of methods used to raise and position all of the stone remains debated. Merer's diary does not settle that engineering question. What it does document is already substantial. Stone had to be quarried. Crews had to move it. Water routes had to connect extraction areas with the broader Giza landscape. Workers had to be provisioned. Storage and administrative spaces supported the project. Royal authority provided the larger institutional setting in which these systems operated. Here, the river is part of the pyramid's logistical geography, not merely their background. Reconstructed waterways near Giza, the movement described in Merer's record, and the settlement at Hayt el-Ghurab all point toward a monument zone connected to routes of supply and labor. The material contrast is striking without needing embellishment. Stone dominates the surviving pyramid landscape. Mudbrick survives in the settlement that supported work nearby. Papyrus preserves part of the administration. Each material survives differently, and each reveals a different part of the same project. The workers themselves remain visible unevenly. Archaeology preserves the places in which groups lived and worked. Documents such as Merer's diary can preserve names and organized activity, but neither source allows every worker at Giza to be placed into one legal or social category. The evidence is strong enough to reject simple pictures of an undifferentiated mass, but it does not justify replacing one universal claim with another. At the human scale, monumental construction becomes a chain of repeated tasks. Stone is extracted. It is moved toward water. A crew transports it. Goods and provisions support workers. Storage and administrative spaces help keep the project functioning. The monument depends on each stage, without any one surviving source describing the whole sequence. Giza is especially clear when viewed as a river system. The famous structures remain at the center, but they are connected outward to quarries, routes, settlements, storage, work groups, and records. The Nile ties many of those relationships together. By keeping to what the evidence actually documents, the unresolved engineering questions can remain unresolved without becoming a mystery. The precise mechanics of lifting every block are not necessary to understand the larger achievement. Logistics itself was a form of organization on a remarkable scale. Royal building, however, was not the only institutional world shaped by movement, stored goods, stone architecture, and organized labor. Along the Nile, temples also gathered people, offerings, records, and resources into structured landscapes. Leaving the pyramid field does not leave those larger systems behind. Stone remains, but its function changes. Instead of concentrating on construction, we can follow movement through temple spaces, offerings, household practices, and processions. The stone landscape changes again. At Giza, stone carried the weight of a royal building project. In temples, stone could define courts, thresholds, gateways, and interior spaces through which ritual activity was organized. The material is familiar, but the function is different. A temple was a building, but also an institution. Its spaces had differing levels of access, and its personnel, offerings, records, and ritual routines all belonged to that organized setting. Architecture helped organize those activities. Moving inward could mean passing from more open courts toward increasingly restricted areas, although temple plans and practices changed across periods and places. That spatial pattern matters because religion was practiced through places as well as texts. An offering had to be brought somewhere. A ritual object had to be stored, handled, or presented. Personnel worked within a built environment. Inscriptions and reliefs recorded or represented formal acts, but the walls themselves also shaped movement. The evidence does not allow one simple statement about what every Egyptian believed. Formal temple texts preserve particular religious ideas and ritual purposes. They are important sources, but they do not provide direct access to every individual's private thoughts. Religious practice also appeared beyond major temples. Household contexts preserve another scale. Objects and cult installations found in domestic settings show that religious activity could take place within or near houses. These remains broaden the picture created by monumental temples. They do not show that every household followed the same practices, kept the same objects, or addressed the same divine figures in the same way. Votive objects provide another material trace. Such objects were dedicated within religious settings and could express participation in cult practice without requiring a long written account. Their forms and contexts varied. Here, their importance lies in the physical act of dedication. An object placed within a sacred setting connected an individual or group to an institution, shrine, or ritual practice. The contrast with household evidence is useful. A small cult installation in a domestic setting and a votive object placed in a larger sacred context belong to different kinds of practice, but both move the history of religion away from theology alone. They leave material evidence of actions carried out in particular places. What those actions meant to each participant may be difficult to recover, yet the objects and settings still show that religious life extended across several scales of the inhabited landscape. This is also where temples meet the wider systems already followed along the Nile. Offerings required goods. Temple personnel performed organized roles. Buildings needed maintenance. Records could accompany institutional activity. Temples could possess resources and participate in economic life, but the scale and character of that role varied through time. It would be misleading to imagine one unchanging temple economy governing the whole country. Kingship entered these spaces as well. Royal inscriptions and ritual representations connect the king to temple activity and divine order, but such images are purpose-shaped evidence. They show how kingship was formally represented within ritual institutions. They should not be treated as neutral records of how every person understood royal power. The focus is sacred space and movement, temples, household practices, offerings, and one documented Theban procession. For that processional example, the setting is New Kingdom Thebes. Here, the Opet festival linked major sacred places through formal movement. The festival is especially useful because it turns ritual from something fixed inside one building into something that occupied a wider landscape. The procession connected major temples within the Theban sacred environment. Ritual objects moved between sacred places, and kingship formed part of the festival context. The exact form of the festival changed over the New Kingdom, so it should not be imagined as one identical ceremony repeated without variation. The surviving evidence includes temple reliefs, inscriptions, and architectural settings associated with the festival. These sources make root and ritual structure visible, but they remain formal representations. They do not allow us to reconstruct the exact crowd, sound, emotion, or experience of every person present. That limitation helps keep the procession at the right scale. What can be followed securely is movement between places. Temple space opens outward. A formal procession crosses or follows known routes within the sacred geography of Thebes. River or river-adjacent movement formed part of some versions and settings of this ritual landscape, but the safest emphasis remains on the documented connection among sacred places. The Opet festival should also remain what it is: one New Kingdom Theban example. It was not a national template for all Egyptian festivals, and it should not be used to summarize religious practice across 3,000 years. Its value is more specific. Earlier in our journey, we followed grain from fields to storage, boats between settlements, workers through organized projects, and records through administrative systems. OPET shows that ritual movement could also connect important places. The Nile landscape was crossed not only by cargo and labor, but by formal religious activity. The scale can now narrow again. A temple court and a household cult installation belonged to very different settings, yet both preserve evidence for religious practice. A votive object and a royal inscription also differ greatly in scale and purpose. Placing them beside one another does not make them equivalent. It shows why ancient Egyptian religion cannot be reconstructed from one category of evidence alone. Archaeology contributes objects and built spaces. Inscriptions and ritual texts contribute formal language. Votive material shows acts of dedication. Domestic evidence brings religious practice into household settings. Processional evidence shows movement between sacred places. Each source reveals only part of the larger religious landscape. That landscape was connected to the Nile world already familiar from the earlier journey. Temples stood within settlements and regional systems. Goods moved toward institutions. People served in different roles. Ritual could extend beyond interior rooms into courts, routes, and processions. The river and its surrounding landscapes remained part of how places were connected. As the journey moves into a quieter stretch, the distinction between sacred space and burial space becomes especially useful. Temples were places of ongoing institutional and ritual activity among the living. Cemeteries and tombs created another kind of landscape, often placed toward the desert margins beyond cultivated ground. The transition is geographical as well as thematic. From temple courts and processional routes, attention can move outward again, past inhabited and cultivated zones, toward places where bodies, objects, texts, and architecture were arranged for burial and remembrance. The river remains nearby as the familiar axis of settlement and movement. Beyond it, at the edge of cultivation, another set of surviving materials waits in the desert ground. Beyond the cultivated ground, the landscape changes quickly. In many parts of the Nile Valley, settlement and fields lay close to desert margins, and cemeteries were often placed in those drier zones beyond the agricultural land. The distance might be small on a map, but it marked a different use of space. Houses and fields on one side, tombs and burial grounds on the other. This relationship varied from place to place. Not every cemetery occupied the same position, and burial landscapes changed across Egyptian history. Yet the desert margin provides a useful orientation because dry conditions often helped preserve materials that would have survived less well in wetter inhabited areas. Tombs themselves varied widely. Some burials were architecturally elaborate, others were much simpler. Stone, mudbrick, coffins, containers, grave goods, painted surfaces, and written texts appear in different combinations depending on period, place, wealth, status, and access to resources. That variation matters because the most visible funerary remains are not necessarily the most representative. Monumental tombs and richly furnished burials survive conspicuously and have received enormous attention. They preserve valuable evidence, but they should not be allowed to define burial experience for everyone who lived along the Nile. Simpler burials can be harder to recover or less visually prominent, yet they are essential to the same history. Differences in architecture and grave furnishings show that funerary investment was uneven. The cemetery landscape preserves social distinction alongside shared concern with burial and remembrance, though the meaning of those differences must be interpreted case by case. Treatment of the body also changed through time. Artificial preservation, usually grouped under the broad term mummification, involved different techniques and different levels of investment. There was no single procedure carried out in exactly the same way for every person across ancient Egyptian history. The technical details can remain brief. Bodies might be wrapped and treated with materials intended to slow decay and preserve form. The precise methods varied. What survives archaeologically may include wrappings, coffins, burial containers, and the body itself, each offering different kinds of evidence about treatment and burial practice. Mummified human remains can also be studied scientifically, but such evidence belongs to particular individuals and contexts. Analysis may reveal information about age, health, disease, injury, diet, or treatment in specific cases. Those findings are valuable precisely because they are specific. They should not be expanded into a description of an entire population without supporting evidence. After this close attention to the body, the broader cemetery landscape is worth restoring. A burial took place within a larger arrangement of tomb, objects, inscriptions, pathways, neighboring graves, and surrounding terrain. The desert edge held accumulated traces of many burials across time. Some tombs were revisited, altered, reused, or incorporated into later landscapes. The cemetery was not always a place fixed at one historical moment. Grave goods provide another material scale. Containers, furnishings, tools, food-related objects, ornaments, and other possessions could be placed with the dead in some burials. Their presence varied greatly. A richly furnished tomb cannot be used to define what everyone received, just as an elite house cannot define every Egyptian household. Funerary images and models require the same caution. They can preserve detailed representations of estate work and food production. The Tomb of Wa from the Middle Kingdom is one useful example of funerary material that preserves models connected with estate life and production. Such models are valuable evidence, but they had funerary and symbolic purposes. They are not miniature photographs of ordinary life. Written funerary material also changed across time. Texts could be placed in or on funerary monuments and objects, connecting burial with ideas about continued existence, protection, and remembrance. Access to particular funerary texts and practices was not constant, and the evidence is especially rich for people able to invest substantial resources in burial. Scholars have sometimes described changes in funerary access with the phrase democratization of the afterlife. The phrase suggests a widening of practices or texts that had once been more restricted, but the interpretation is debated. Changes in funerary evidence do not necessarily mean that social distinctions disappeared or that access expanded in one simple, even progression. It is safer to keep the material differences in view. Tomb architecture varied, treatment of bodies varied, grave goods varied, written texts varied, resources and social position mattered. So did chronology and local practice. The evidence also preserves remembrance in physical form. A name written on a coffin, an inscription in a tomb, an object deposited with a burial, or a structure maintained and revisited could extend a person's presence within a family or community landscape. The emotional meaning of those acts cannot be generalized, but their material expression can still be studied. Funerary archaeology is unusually rich, partly because burial contexts were designed to contain and preserve things. That richness creates its own bias. Bodies, coffins, grave goods, painted scenes, and inscriptions can survive in combinations rarely matched by ordinary settlement deposits. Ancient Egypt can appear more funerary in the archaeological record than it was in everyday life. The desert environment contributes to that imbalance. Dry conditions can preserve organic material that might disappear elsewhere. Meanwhile, settlements on cultivated ground could be rebuilt repeatedly or disturbed by later use. The contrast between cemetery preservation and settlement loss is another reason the surviving past must be read selectively. By this point, the burial landscape has become less a subject of death than a subject of survival. Tombs remain in altered ground. Objects remain in chambers or museum collections. Inscriptions preserve names and formal expressions. Wrapped bodies preserve biological evidence. Each category survives for different reasons and with different limitations. The Nile still provides the larger orientation: cultivated land-supported settlements and institutions. Beyond it, desert margin cemeteries accumulated another record of Egyptian society. Over centuries, both sides of that boundary changed. Those centuries widened the journey again. Political centers shifted. Institutions changed. Outside powers entered Egypt, and old places were reused in new settings. The river corridor remained, but the societies organized around it did not stand still. The surviving tombs and cemetery landscapes make that long change visible without bringing the story to an ending. They simply leave us at a quieter point from which to follow the Nile through changing kingdoms. The cemeteries, settlements, temples, and monuments beside the Nile did not all belong to one unchanging Egypt. They accumulated across centuries in which political centers shifted, institutions expanded or contracted, settlements changed, and connections beyond the valley took different forms. The river corridor endured, but the systems built around it did not remain still. The Old Kingdom world already encountered at Giza shows one form of concentrated royal power. Large building projects drew together stone, labor, storage, provisioning, administration, and transport. Royal monuments became unusually durable markers in the landscape, while the settlements and practical systems that supported them survived more unevenly. That concentration did not continue in precisely the same form. During the period that followed the Old Kingdom, political authority became more divided. The details are complex, and the evidence does not support one simple story of collapse caused by a single failure. The important point here is that the Nile corridor continued to hold settlements, agricultural production, local institutions, and older monuments, even while central political arrangements changed. By the Middle Kingdom, political authority had again become more consolidated. Institutions and royal building programs operated within a reorganized state, and the Nile remained the practical line connecting Upper and Lower Egypt. The river still carried people and goods. Agricultural land still fed households and institutions. Written administration still connected stored resources with obligations and work. Continuity did not mean sameness. A Middle Kingdom settlement did not simply reproduce an Old Kingdom one. Political priorities, administrative arrangements, monumental programs, and regional relationships could change even when familiar materials remained present. Mudbrick walls could rise beside older remains. New inscriptions could appear within landscapes already marked by earlier rulers and communities. The river makes those changes easier to compare because it keeps returning the same practical concerns. We can look at where goods were stored and how settlements were connected, then at which institutions controlled labor or resources, and which buildings received new investment? The answers shifted from period to period, but the underlying patterns remain recognizable. Looking for those recurring systems allows chronology to stay visible without requiring a continuous sequence of kings. It also keeps the Nile at the center of the story. The New Kingdom brought another shift in scale. Thebes became especially prominent, with major temple landscapes forming part of this political and religious world. Royal power reached into wider regions, and Egypt's external relationships expanded in ways that affected resources, movement, and political authority. Those connections reached south toward Nubia and outward beyond the Nile Valley. They did not all take the form of simple trade. Materials and people could move through exchange and diplomacy, but also through tribute, migration, political control, or conflict. An imported object, by itself, does not reveal one uncomplicated commercial journey. The river remains the anchor. Goods arriving from outside the core valley still entered Egyptian systems of storage, transport, production, and institutional use. Boats still connected settlements along the Nile. Temples accumulated resources. Royal projects still required labor and material. What changed were the political conditions under which those familiar systems operated. After the New Kingdom, political authority again became more divided. The period conventionally called the Third Intermediate Period contained shifting centers of power and changing regional relationships. A ruler list would make this change sound more precise than it needs to be here. At the scale of the Nile landscape, the more useful observation is that institutions, settlements, temples, and older monuments continued to be used within a less uniformly centralized political world. This is one of the recurring patterns of Egyptian history. Central authority could strengthen, weaken, or be reorganized, while daily and institutional systems persisted in altered forms. A granary did not cease to matter because a political center changed. A temple could continue to occupy an important place even as rulers and administrative structures shifted. A settlement might grow, decline, or change function without the river itself becoming a new river. In the later first millennium BCE, Egypt was increasingly entangled with powers beyond its traditional borders. Political control changed hands more than once, and foreign rulers became part of Egyptian political history. These transitions matter, but they do not need to become a sequence of invasions or battles here. Royal inscriptions from such periods must also be read carefully. They were created for particular political and religious purposes and can present idealized versions of power, victory, or legitimacy. Archaeology, settlement history, and material evidence provide other ways to see what changed and what continued. The late period belongs to this long river story as another phase of transformation, rather than as a simple decline. Older temples and monuments remained present. Institutions could be maintained, adapted, or reinterpreted. Political authority shifted, while communities along the Nile continued to farm, store goods, travel, work, worship, bury their dead, and use landscapes already dense with earlier history. By the Ptolemaic period, beginning after the Macedonian conquest, Egypt had entered a new political setting connected strongly to the wider Mediterranean world. Yet this did not erase the older river landscape. Egyptian temples continued to be important institutions. Settlements continued along the Nile, and long-established religious and administrative traditions interacted with new ruling structures. The Ptolemaic phase was a final major transformation within this ancient chronological frame. The river still linked the valley and delta, while Egypt's political world was increasingly tied to Mediterranean systems as well. In 30 BCE, Ptolemaic rule ended and Egypt became part of the Roman Empire. That date marks the end point of this journey. It does not mark the disappearance of Egyptian society, culture, or the Nile landscape. People continued to live among the same fields, settlements, temples, cemeteries, and older monuments under different political conditions. By now, the long chronology can begin to recede. Across these changing kingdoms, the recurring systems are more useful than a final list of rulers. Agricultural land remained fundamental. Boats remained practical. Settlements changed but endured. Institutions collected and redistributed resources. Temples and cemeteries accumulated new layers beside older ones. Stone monuments outlasted many of the political arrangements that created them. The surviving landscape contains time in layers. An older monument could stand beside a later building. A settlement might be rebuilt over earlier occupation. A temple could be altered or reused. A cemetery could remain visible long after the political system in which its earliest tombs were created had changed. Those layers lead away from political chronology and toward a quieter question: why some traces survived while others disappeared. The rulers can now fall out of view. What remains beside the Nile is material: stone, mudbrick, pottery, papyrus, burials, tools, records, and the traces of river channels that no longer carry water. Those remains lead into archaeology itself. A mudbrick wall can survive as a low line in the ground, while a stone monument remains visible from a great distance. Both may once have belonged to the same inhabited landscape. Their different survival is one reason the ancient Egypt known through archaeology does not preserve every part of life equally. Stone usually endures more readily than mudbrick. Dry desert conditions can preserve materials that would decay or disappear elsewhere. Settlements built on or near productive land could be rebuilt, disturbed, eroded, or affected by groundwater. Cemeteries at desert margins could sometimes preserve bodies, coffins, textiles, and other organic materials under conditions less common in inhabited zones. What survives is uneven. Stone, mudbrick, objects, texts, and traces of old river channels preserve different parts of the story. This unevenness has shaped the modern image of ancient Egypt. Temples, tombs, pyramids, and carved stone are highly visible. Domestic buildings, workshops, storage spaces, and riverfront environments can be harder to recover. The difference does not mean that monumental and funerary life mattered more to ancient people than houses, fields, work, and transport. It means that the archaeological record has its own pattern of survival. Settlement archaeology helps correct that imbalance. At places such as Amarna and Edfu, excavated walls, streets, rooms, storage spaces, workshops, and objects reveal parts of the inhabited world that stone monuments alone cannot provide. Each site is selective and particular. Together with other excavated settlements, they broaden the range of questions that can be asked. A storage jar may survive after the grain inside it has vanished. A broken writing surface may remain after the office or storeroom in which it was used has disappeared. Workshop debris may preserve the act of production more clearly than the finished object, which could have been carried elsewhere. A mudbrick wall may preserve a room plan even when the roof, furnishings, and people are gone. Documents survive selectively as well. Papyrus is organic and vulnerable, yet some documents have survived under favorable conditions. Ostraka and inscriptions preserve other kinds of writing on more durable surfaces. These texts can illuminate deliveries, work, rations, land, ritual, and administration, while still representing the concerns of the people and institutions that produce them. The same selectivity applies to burials. Tombs were places where objects, bodies, inscriptions, and architecture could be deliberately enclosed. Desert conditions could aid preservation. This helps explain why funerary evidence forms such a large part of what survives from ancient Egypt. It also means that the archaeological record can make death more visible than many ordinary activities of life. Absence needs caution. If a fragile object is missing from one site, that absence does not prove that the object was never used there. If a kind of building has disappeared, it may reflect later disturbance or the materials from which it was made. Archaeological silence can sometimes be meaningful, but preservation has to be considered before silence becomes a historical conclusion. The river adds another form of incompleteness. The Nile channels seen today are not an exact map of the channels known to ancient communities. Over centuries, waterways shifted, narrowed, became buried, or dried. Sediments and other buried landscape evidence can help researchers reconstruct parts of those earlier river systems. The question is simple: where was the river in relation to the places people built and used? Near some pyramid zones, research into buried Nile branches has contributed to reconstructions of substantial ancient waterways. Work around Giza likewise suggests that parts of the monument landscape may once have been more closely connected to Nile channels than the modern geography implies. These are reconstructions based on evidence. They are not photographs of a lost river. The location, extent, and history of ancient channels must be built from sediments, landforms, archaeological relationships, and other observations. New evidence can refine those models without turning the landscape into a solved puzzle. At this point, the familiar parts of the journey can be seen differently. The river is both a surviving watercourse and a history of changing channels. Cultivated land is both a productive landscape and a place where later use can disturb earlier remains. A settlement is both a place where people lived and an archaeological pattern of walls, objects, surfaces, and gaps. A boat may survive as material remains or an image, while most journeys leave no direct trace. Grain can survive as plant remains, but its movement may also appear indirectly through storage spaces and records. Mudbrick and stone preserve differently. A small writing surface may carry a detail that a monument does not. A tomb object may survive because it was placed in a dry burial environment. A work record may name an activity that left little visible trace in the landscape. Archaeology draws these forms of evidence together, but they never become a complete inventory of ancient life. Interpretation, therefore, remains provisional in places. Excavation exposes only part of a site. Later buildings may cut through earlier ones. Groundwater and erosion can damage what survives. Ancient people themselves reused buildings, moved objects, altered monuments, and rebuilt settlements. Modern archaeology begins with a record that had already been changed many times before excavation started. The incompleteness is not a reason to abandon reconstruction. It is the condition under which reconstruction works. A wall can still show where a room stood. A jar can still show storage. A record can still preserve a delivery. A buried channel can still change the way a settlement or monument is placed within its ancient landscape. As the evidence becomes fragmentary, the Nile remains the clearest point of return. Cultivated land still meets desert in many parts of the valley. Stone monuments still stand where mudbrick buildings have become lower and harder to see. Old cemetery ground still lies beyond former inhabited zones. Beneath modern surfaces, some channels that once shaped movement are now dry or buried. The ancient landscape was never fixed, and neither is its archaeological record. Some traces survive because they were made from durable materials. Some because they were sealed in dry ground. Some because a document happened to escape destruction. Others survive only as stains, fragments, low walls, scattered objects, or changes in sediment. No single category can recover the whole society. Monumental inscriptions speak from particular institutions. Administrative texts preserve selected acts of recording. Cemeteries favor the dead. Settlements preserve only what local conditions and later history allowed to remain. Environmental evidence can restore parts of the physical setting, but it too is interpreted from incomplete traces. The result is not a perfectly restored ancient Egypt. It is a landscape reconstructed piece by piece, with some areas clear and others uncertain. Along the Nile, those pieces still belong together. A field leads toward storage. A jar belongs to a room. A tool belongs to work. A record belongs to an institution. Stone belongs to a monument or temple. A tomb belongs to a desert margin cemetery. A buried channel belongs to an older version of the river landscape. The people who used these places are not equally visible in what survives. Many remain unnamed. Their houses may be incomplete. Their objects may be scattered. Their work may appear only as debris, a short record, or a change made to a building. Yet those traces are enough to keep the landscape anchored in history. The Nile corridor changed repeatedly, and the communities along it changed with it. What remains now is the uneven material record of those changes: stone and mudbrick, objects and writing, cultivated ground and desert margins, and old channels beneath the later landscape. The river continues through Egypt, while the evidence beside it remains partial, layered, and quietly unfinished.